There's a very long history of anti-Asian racism and sentiment in the United States. And to really understand its origins, we have to look back to the early 1800s to something that is called the coolie labor trade. Next slide. So the coolie labor trade was developed as a response to the abolition of slavery by the British Empire, which left a need for the British Empire to replace the labor of emancipated Africans. So the empire turned to laborers from South China and South Asia to work on their colonial plantations. And these laborers became known as coolies. They were part of a very degraded labor caste in the sense that they were forced to work in really impoverished conditions. And as a result, they developed an international reputation for being known as dirty and diseased. And this meant that by the time Chinese immigrants came to the United States in the mid 1800s as part of the San Francisco Gold Rush, they brought with them a lot of anti-coolie beliefs that had developed at this point. And this led to a lot of tensions between the white miners and the Chinese miners, and also anti-Asian violence and racism. Next slide. So this violence and racism can be understood as an ideology called yellow peril. And yellow peril is this idea that people of Asian descent are pollutants and threats to Western society, that they constitute a monolithic race that is made up of perpetual foreigners to the United States that can never possibly assimilate to US culture and society. This ideology has permeated so many different facets of US culture and society, including international relations and domestic affairs and popular culture. The ideology has justified many acts of US imperialism and warfare in Asia, for example, in Korea and Vietnam, in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it also has led to anti-immigrant legislation over the years, most notably with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which was the first landmark piece of legislation that barred immigration solely on the basis of nationality. And this anti-immigrant legislation was later expanded to include Asians of all ethnicities in 1924 and wasn't fully repealed until 1965. So the yellow peril ideology has also justified the violation of civil liberties of Asian Americans throughout history, such as the mass incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II without due process, and the racial profiling and targeting of American Muslims of Asian and Arab descent in the post 9/11 war on terror. Next slide. So a lot of folks will say, okay, we have this thing today called the model minority myth, so that must mean that yellow peril ideology no longer exists. But actually, this is not true because we can really understand the model minority myth as an extension or counterpart to the yellow peril ideology. And this is because both of these ideas are rooted in the idea that Asians are threatening to Western or US culture because they are exceptional in some way, whether that is, as the yellow peril says, they are exceptional for being dangerous and threatening and unassimilable, or as the model minority myth says, they are exceptional for being too excellent and therefore potentially threatening to US hegemony in global markets. So it's important to also understand that the model minority myth was coined in 1966 by a white male sociologist named William Peterson. And he coined this term in an article called Success Story, Japanese American Style, which was published in the New York Times. And in this article, he really praised Japanese Americans for overcoming discrimination. And in this way, weaponized the concept of model minority to shame Black and Brown folks who were advocating for civil rights at the time, and also to erase and deny the history of systemic abuses against Asian Americans, including Japanese Americans. So the model minority myth often today is pointed to as a way of saying, oh, well, Asian Americans now have achieved a status that we can understand as white adjacency. But actually, it's especially in moments like our contemporary one, where we see an upsurge in anti-Asian racism and violence during this COVID pandemic, that we see how the status of white adjacency is conditional and very easily stripped away. Next slide. So the model minority myth says that Asian Americans are really passive and docile and hardworking and never protest the status quo or resist. But actually, this is very much not true. There is a long history of Asian American activism in the United States, just like there is a long history of anti-Asian racism in the United States. And I have on the slide here a few images to give a sense of this history of Asian American activism, images of activists protesting the war in Vietnam in the 1960s or joining forces as part of the Third World Liberation Front to advocate for the creation of the first ethnic studies departments in the country. So I'm ending with these images just so that we can think as we move into our conversation about anti-Asian racism today, about how any form of activism or resistance against these forces is part of a long legacy that we should be proud of. Next slide. So I have just a few further resources if you'd like to learn more or get involved. And I believe we're going to be posting some of these links in the chat, so you can check them out there. Thank you so much. And we'll go back to you, Cindy.
Thank you so much, Roberta. As you can see, the sentiment that we're going to be talking about today is not a new concept for this country. It is not something that just started in the past year, and we would like to have a further conversation about this.